Hey students, this is Mr. Moore. I'm excited for you guys to be here with our lecture, our first lecture on World War II. I have a total of three, actually kind of four. Week 26 talks about the interwar years. And so we see the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, and we see the rise of Imperial Japan. That was last week. Here with week 27, I'm going to give you an overview of World War II. Next week, we're going to focus on the war in Europe. And the week after that, we're going to focus on the war in Asia. So it's really like 3 or maybe even 4 weeks long. In some ways, though, if you go back, World War II and World War I are completely and utterly linked together. So I had 2 weeks where I lectured on World War I, and 1 week where I lectured on the Russian Revolution, and then the interwar years, and then these three, weeks on World War II. Maybe it's more like a total of 6 or 7 weeks, because, like Winston Churchill said, you shouldn't look at World War One and World War II as two separate things. You should see them as two parts of one great conflict. The 20th century is a century of warfare, and the two biggest wars in the history of humankind happen: World War I and World War II, and they are completely interfused. So my objective today is not to cover everything in World War II, but really to give you an overview so that over the next couple of weeks as we get into World War II, hopefully you'll be able to piece this together in your mind. Today, we're going to focus on some of the important names, key countries that get involved in this gigantic, huge, catastrophic, epic conflict that really defines the world that we live in today. The countries that run the world today are the winners of World War II, still. Today, one of the most important international organizations is the United Nations. On the United Nations Security Council, there are 5 permanent members. They have absolute veto control in the UN. Those 5 countries that hold permanent seats in the United Nations Security Council are the winners of World War II: the United States, France, Great Britain, Russia, and China. They still run the world today. So if you're still not seeing the connection between history and the world that you live in, I think there's no better place to start making that connection than World War II. Both of my grandpas served in World War II. I knew them. I knew them and heard things from their own mouths. So this is no longer, we start to get to this point, and it depends on how old you are, or how old your parents are, or how old your grandparents are. But we start to get to a certain point in a history class where it stops being history and it starts to be something that you can directly connect to, something that's happened in your lifetime or your parents' lifetime or your grandparents' lifetime, something that you can literally connect to. And it stops being history, and it starts being current events or old current events, things that just barely happened. Here we go. We're going to dive into World War II. I think the most important thing in my mind when it comes to understanding World War II is understanding your geography, because World War II is going to take place in two distinct places. There's going to be two theaters of the war. So there's two separate areas of the world where World War II takes place. There's the European theater and there's the Asian theater. Americans call the Asian theater the Pacific theater of war. And the reason we call it the Pacific is because we spent our entire war effort getting across the Pacific to go fight the Japanese, right? So we didn't even land troops in Japan before the war was over, right? So we do most of our fighting in the Asian theater, actually in the Pacific Ocean. And I'll show you a map in a minute to try to help this solidify. So as Americans, we talk about the Europe theater and the Pacific, where really it's an Asian war. And most of the killing and dying and fighting actually takes place on the continent of Asia. But as Americans, we never really did much fighting actually in Asia. Okay. But there are millions, millions, tens of millions of people that die fighting in Asia. It's just that we never quite got all the way there. And again, I'll show you a map in just a minute. So the European theater starts a little bit later than the Asian theater. So let me just back up for a minute. If I was to ask you the dates of World War One, they're pretty clean. You know, World War One starts in 1914 and ends in 1918, with the Treaty of Versailles being worked on the next year in 1919. In fact, when World War One ends on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, see, that's pretty precise, right? Pretty clean and clear. When I ask you a question like, when does World War II start? Well, it depends. You have to ask me a question. You have to say, well, which part of the war are you talking about, Mr. Moore? Because there's a different start time in Europe and a different start time in Asia. World War II starts in Europe in September of 1939 with the invasion of Poland, and it ends in May of 1945. So if you're talking about the European theater of World War II, it starts in 39 and it ends in 45. And that's 1939 to 1945. Now, is the Asian War shorter or longer than the European theater? The answer is absolutely longer. The conflict in Asia starts at least by 1937. Now, you said, what do you mean, at least by 1937? Well, there's some people who might go back to, say, like 1931, and there's this situation that happens in Manchuria, aka Manchukuo, when the Japanese are taking over the northern part of China. Is that a part of World War II? Because it bleeds right into the later Japanese invasion of mainland China, right? Or did it start maybe even earlier when Japan was taking over Korea? Well, now those dates are even before World War One. So we got to pause and we got to say that there is conflict and problems happening in Asia long before Hitler and the Nazis start rolling their tanks in Europe. The Asian conflict is definitely longer. So World War II starts at least by 1937 when the Japanese invaded mainland China. Some people refer to this as the Rape of Nanking or Nanjing. Some people have a problem with those words, but there was definitely some horrific things that happened in Nanjing. It was a slaughterhouse. It was horrific, and the Chinese like to play it down and say it wasn't as bad as, or the Japanese like to play it down and say it wasn't as bad. The Chinese say it was horrific, probably somewhere in between, but definitely it hit the international press, and it's one of the things that starts to paint the Japanese as the bad guys. It ended in August of 1945. So if you think about this, it starts before and ends after the war in Europe. It's almost like there was two separate wars going on at the same time. So World War II is definitely the most global conflict to ever happen. And there's two distinct theaters of the war. And that's why we're going to deal with them separately. Next week, I'm going to focus on just the war in Europe. And then the week after that, I'm going to focus on just the war in Asia. Okay. This week, we're going to kind of get an overview of the entire thing. Because we're Americans, I'm producing this for a high school history class, an AP European history class in California. We're going to focus, a little bit of America's involvement. Just like in World War One, the Americans got involved significantly after the conflict was already going on. When we talk about World War One, it was kind of hazy why we got involved. If you just pause for a minute, with World War One, we talked about the Zimmerman Note. We talked about the sinking of the Lusitania. Maybe more importantly, the unrestricted submarine warfare. There was multiple things that kind of compiled on top of each other to drag the United States slowly into the First World War. And we were there for a very short time. The cost of life for Americans was low, and the amount of money and our industrial impact on World War One was huge. We banked on World War One. Our economy reached the biggest economy in the world by the end of World War One. And of course, we hit the roaring 20s where our economy was booming, maybe a little too fast, which causes problems and we slump into a worldwide Great Depression. But that affects the entire world during the 1930s. But by the time we're done with World War II, the United States is going to be the biggest economy, and we're not going to leave that spot yet. China's probably going to overtake the United States in the next few years, and it's right there, very close to economically to the size of the United States. So when I ask people why does the United States get involved in World War One, it's a little more hazy and a little bit more. You have to put the puzzle pieces together. Why does the United States get involved in World War II? It's quite clear and very dramatic. On December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan, right? That's what Franklin D. Roosevelt said at a joint session in Congress as he was asking for a declaration of war. Now, we have talked about this, especially last week. We kind of mentioned this. Why would the Japanese randomly, all of a sudden, attack the United States in Hawaii? Why? Did we provoke them first? I have never seen a fight happen on a high school campus where both parties weren't a little bit to blame. If you ask one person, you say, hey, why did you get in this fight? They'll always blame the other person. Nobody ever says, well, I'm just a jerk and I decided to punch somebody. So if you ask the Japanese, why did you bomb Pearl Harbor? There's got to be a reason there. Some Americans erroneously think that we hadn't done anything to Japan first. So what did we do to Japan? We cut off their oil supplies. They were getting all of their oil from us, and we weren't too happy with what they were doing in Asia and how aggressive they were being, and especially that attack on Nanjing in China. We were trying to send a clear message that we weren't happy with what Japan was doing, so we cut off their oil supplies. Well, why were the Japanese invading China? Well, Europeans were doing it first, right? The Japanese realized that if they didn't play this imperialism game, they were going to be taken over. In fact, US warships, US gunships showed up in Tokyo Bay unprovoked and forced the Japanese to open their country to international trade in the 1850s. So 100 years before Pearl Harbor, the United States might have provoked, might have pushed Japan first. It's interesting. There's always a dominoes sets. And I'm not saying that that's the reason that Pearl Harbor happened, but there is a direct connection. You can always see one event leading to another. Okay. It was unprovoked, but maybe there was some reason. There's always a reason. Nobody bombs another country for no reason. I guess that's my point. You know, one of the biggest things that happened during my lifetime was 9/11. And I remember I was doing my student teaching and I was driving to go teach a class at a high school, finishing up my college degree to become a teacher. And I remember hearing the report on the news, on the radio, and then turning on the TV and seeing it kind of unfold in real time. And there was a lot of people who were saying, you know, why would people want to blow up our World Trade Centers? We didn't do anything to them. And I thought that seems kind of ignorant. Nobody's going to blow up our World Trade Centers for no reason. There's something we did. There's always a reason. Now, what we did might have been justified. It might not have. You've got to be careful because you can't say, well, we deserved it. No, no, no. I'm not saying that anybody deserved it. But people don't just do something for nothing. There's always a motivation. There's always a reason, whether it's right or wrong. When the Germans are going to attack Poland, there's going to be a reason. When they invade Poland and start World War II in Europe, there's a reason that the Germans feel justified. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying that the Germans should have invaded Poland, but they felt like they had a reason to be there. The Germans felt like they had a reason to start World War II because they felt shafted from World War I. So all of these events can become interconnected. And that's one of the major skills that we want you to learn in a history class, to be able to see the developments of history as they unfold, not just random facts, but seeing the interconnectedness. Now, as I said before, there are two distinct theaters of war. When I say the European theater, I also include Africa. Africa is right next to Europe, and North Africa is going to be heavily involved in the fighting during World War II. Major battles are going to take place between European powers in Africa. Some people may say that Mussolini kind of started World War II when he invaded Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. Okay, so Africa is definitely going to be involved in this European theater. Obviously, there's also an Asian theater, and it's going to include a giant chunk of the Pacific Ocean. The United States is going to get involved when the Japanese simultaneously attack two U.S. territories, the Hawaiian territory and the Philippines. Now, I know that today Hawaii is a state, but back in 1941, it was not. It was a territory. The United States had taken Hawaii from the natives, kicked the queen out of her own country, and claimed it as a U.S. territory. We had also seized the Philippines in a small war with the Spanish American War at the end of the 1800s. So the United States had been very involved in Asian interests and had been involved in some of the stuff that had happened in China, like the Boxer Rebellion. Okay. So the United States has been very involved in this area for quite some time before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th. So I guess there's one more thing to point out, and that would be that the war is going on for quite a long time before the United States gets involved. If we get involved in 1941, but it starts at least by 39 in Europe and at least by 37 in Asia, maybe as early as 31 in Asia, we're coming in 10 years late. I mean, there's quite a bit of stuff going on before Pearl Harbor. Americans see Pearl Harbor as the beginning of World War II, which, if you just think about it logically, you've got to put the puzzle pieces together. How could the Japanese bombing the Hawaiian Islands cause us to go fight Nazis in Europe? Okay, so that's where we've got to get to, right? Okay, so let's dive into it a little bit here. Now, again, I want to remind you, I don't expect you to understand World War II perfectly after one lecture. We're going to be working on this week and over the next 2 weeks. So I'm going to get specific next week about the war in Europe, and the week after that, specific about the war in Asia. Remember, today is just an overview. Now, when we talked about World War I, we talked about the Allies and the Central Powers. Now, during World War II, we talk about the Axis and the Allies. Okay? Remember, the two teams are very similar to the World War I teams. Remember, the Central Powers from World War I were Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire has been destroyed, and a mandate system has relegated those lands to the winning allies. And so Italy, remember, it switches teams for World War II. And of course, the newcomer is really the Japanese. Some people will point out that the Japanese also switched teams, but they were so insignificant in World War I that I don't think it's even worth really mentioning, although some people like to point that out. Okay? Simple terms again, the three key players of the Axis are Germany, Italy, and Japan. I'm going to repeat that one more time. The three key players from the Axis are Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, the Allies from World War I is almost exactly the Allies for World War II. France, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Russia, except after the Russian Revolution, we're calling it the Soviet Union. Remember the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, or the Soviet Union? aka Russia. Sometimes we use those interchangeably. There is a difference territorially and definitely politically. But nonetheless, I might even say Russia, and sometimes we'll just say Russia, even though we have this change over to the Soviet Union. And of course, in both World War I and World War II, the United States comes in later. Now, trying to keep this simple, then, the four key players of the Allies are France, Britain, Great Britain, Russia, and of course the United States. We also have to remember that places like China fought against Japan. So, in a way, they were also one of our allies, but they weren't engaged in the war in Europe at all, of course. They just happened to be fighting the Japanese, and we were fighting the Japanese. And so sometimes we find ourselves on the same team just because we have a common enemy, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of an idea. There are so many other countries involved, it's really impossible to list them all. If you remember the concept of imperialism, that hasn't gone away. Remember the maps of imperialism that we spent so much time talking about. When I say France, remember France controls a third of Africa and parts of Southeast Asia. The United Kingdom controls a third of Africa and all of South Asia and Australia and Canada. When I say Great Britain, I mean close to a fourth of the world. And the Soviet Union is even bigger than Russia is today. So even though I'm just listing four countries, we really are talking about so much more, if that makes sense. And that's really significant and important to remember. Now, hopefully, you recognize these guys. These are the three big leaders of the Allies. Noticeably missing is the French leader, and we'll talk about why in just a little bit. I guess the bottom line is France is going to get their butt kicked really quick in the war. Let's just get that out there. France is going to get trampled on by the Nazis, and they're going to come at the end. They're going to come back and help win, but that's only after the United States and Great Britain and Canadians and we try to save France, but France is going to get their butt kicked. So this is the leader of the Soviet Union, one of the biggest, evilest, vicious, most ruthless people on the planet Earth that's ever lived, Joseph Stalin. I'd put him on the same category as Hitler. When people think about the most evil person in history, they always think Hitler, and he is. He's horrible and evil, but Stalin's just as bad. But he wasn't on our team. So we don't always paint him as such a bad guy because he was on our team. Okay. This is, of course, President of the United States at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? FDR. Only U.S. president to serve more than 2 terms. In the United States, our first president, George Washington, he left office after his second term, and no president served more than 2 terms until FDR. He was voted into office 4 times. And then after that, we made it an official rule that you couldn't serve more than twice. But he was the guy who made that a requirement because he broke the rules. This is Churchill. He's the prime minister of Great Britain during most of the war. Here's some important leaders during World War II. Allied leaders. The leader of the Soviet Union is Joseph Stalin. Worst guy, worst father in the history of fathers. This is the guy who had one of his wife's families entirely killed because he didn't like them, so he had them all killed. This is the guy, one of Joseph Stalin's sons was trying to kill himself by suicide and was not successful. Shot himself but didn't die. And Joseph Stalin said, "You're not even good enough to kill yourself." That's the kind of father Joseph Stalin was. Leader of the United Kingdom, the prime minister was Winston Churchill, although he was not the prime minister when the war first started. That's going to be Neville Chamberlain. We'll talk about him in a minute. But Winston Churchill is one of the most iconic leaders in the world during World War II. Of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I just pointed him out. He was in a wheelchair. because of polio when he was a little bit younger. He was a man when he got polio, but still became paralyzed. And very significant U.S. president during the Great Depression and World War II. Longest serving president ever. The French guy, this is tricky because France is going to get its butt kicked early in the war. And the Nazis are going to put in a leader named Pétain. And Pétain was like a hero during World War One. But the Nazis are going to kind of use him as like a puppet to run France during the war. And so most people in France are going to look at Pétain as like one of the biggest backstabbers and be ashamed of him. He's going to lead the Vichy government in France. The Vichy government was a government that supported the Nazi regime. Because the Nazis kick France's butt, the Nazis are going to put in a government that's pro-Nazi. There's a guy who consistently resists Nazi occupation during the war, and he's going to become the hero of France. If you fly into Paris, like the first time I went to Paris, I flew into the Charles de Gaulle International Airport. So he's like a hero in their country and served as president multiple times, both during the Fourth and Fifth Republic. He's probably the most significant leader in France in the 20th century, hands down. Charles de Gaulle. Now, if I ask Axis leaders, I don't even have to teach you this. You already know the leader of Germany during World War II is Hitler. Adolf Hitler, one of the biggest, ugliest dirtbags in the history of the world, right? I mean, there's no way to describe how evil this guy is. There's really nothing good you can say about him. I mean, Hitler was just horrific and destroyed both his own country and took millions of lives with him. Nothing good to say about Hitler. He was very effective. He was an incredible speaker. But he ends up ruining his own country. There's really nothing good to say about him. But you've got to understand, why would people follow him then? What makes them motivated to follow Hitler if he's such a horrible guy? And that's a great story to learn because we have to be careful. We don't always know somebody's bad at first. They don't always show their true colors. Of course, Benito Mussolini is the fascist dictator of Italy. He kind of sets the stage for Hitler. In fact, Hitler kind of looks up to Mussolini, at least at the start of the war, kind of, thinking that he is the superior fascist leader. By the end of the war, Hitler definitely stops respecting Mussolini and kind of sees him as a chump. Like he kind of blew it. Mussolini talked a big talk, but he just didn't put it on the fence, lay it on the line like Hitler and the Nazis did. It's interesting with Japan. It's kind of tough to say exactly who's the more important figure. Symbolically and culturally, the emperor of Japan is the leader. His name is Hirohito. However, I think it's also important to point out that the real guy who's running the show, sort of a modern day shogun, he's the prime minister or imperial, like the military leader. This guy's name is Hideki Tojo. So when people talk about the leader of Japan during World War II, often they'll talk about Tojo. However, the people of Japan thought of the emperor as a sort of god on the earth. And so the emperor of Japan is one of the key leaders. By the end of World War II, Adolf Hitler dies. He kills himself. Benito Mussolini is killed, and his body is dragged through the streets of Italian towns and hung up in the town square, and people go by and beat it with bats and clubs. I mean, awful, horrific deaths for Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. Hirohito, even though he's the emperor of Japan when Pearl Harbor is attacked, he gets to stay in power. Hideki Tojo is out of power at the end of World War II, but Hirohito stays in power until 1989. That's like when I was in middle school. And Emperor Hirohito, his son, like the guy who was in charge of Japan during Pearl Harbor, his son is the emperor after him, Akihito, and he just stepped out of power. He's still alive right now. He just relinquished his throne in like 2019, like just a couple of years ago. Hirohito's son, Akihito. So it's really interesting how we have to deal with Japan because Japan, the Japanese just didn't understand the idea of surrender. There's like no concept of surrender in the Japanese military mind. Going back to even like the samurai and their code of Bushido, it just wasn't a possibility. And we'll talk about how World War II ends because it ends in Europe before it ends in Asia. And how it ends in Asia, the Japanese were not going to surrender until we invented the first atomic bomb. The United States is the only country to use an atomic bomb, a nuclear weapon in warfare. And we used it because the Japanese refused to surrender. And the Japanese emperor said, every man, woman, and child will fight until there's not a soul left in Japan. We're not going to surrender. Then we blew up two of their cities with nuclear weapons, atomic bombs. And finally, the Japanese said, okay, let's negotiate a surrender here. But one of the things that they would not do is surrender their emperor, which is why he was able to stay in power. So World War II is a fascinating thing. Um, this is Joseph Stalin with his gigantic, huge freaking mustache. And of course, right here is Lenin. He was the guy who really ran the Russian Revolution and started the Soviet Union. And of course, Stalin is the guy who takes over after Lenin. We talked about that during the Russian Revolution lecture. This is Winston Churchill, right? Famous for his radio chats, we will never surrender. We're going to fight to save our island. He gives these amazing speeches. It's awesome and epic. And during class, I love to play some of his speeches. Of course, doing this remote learning, you're kind of getting the abridged version, but you should check it out. I mean, Churchill's freaking amazing. Okay. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as we've talked about, this is him addressing Congress. After that December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, he's addressing Congress asking for a declaration of war. Remember, the U.S. president cannot declare war. Only Congress can declare war. And this, of course, is a picture of Charles de Gaulle. Not every dude who has a little mustache is Hitler. I mean, it was kind of a faddish thing. Nobody will ever wear a little dinky mustache again because Hitler makes it so evil. But there was other guys who had little dinky mustaches, and this is Charles de Gaulle, really the hero of France. Most of you would recognize Hitler without me showing you a picture because he's so iconic, and his little salute to his troops. He was known as De Führer or Mein Führer, my leader. And of course, this is El Duce, Mussolini, right? The leader of fascist Italy. And these two guys were buddies. I know that all of us think that Hitler was the big dog and Mussolini was his sidekick. But at the beginning, it was Mussolini was the big dog and Hitler was his little sidekick. That changes during the war. And that's one of the things that we'll be addressing. Hideki Tojo, of course, right? He's prime minister of Japan during most of the war. Okay. And after he was convicted of war crimes as a war criminal, and he was executed later after the war. So that's the fate of Tojo. Now, I'm going to give you some other important names. It's going to be interesting because some of you are going to be like, holy cow, this is too big of a list to learn. And some people who know a lot about World War II are going to be mad at me because I didn't include certain people. They're going to be like, Mr. Moore, you totally forgot about this guy or that guy. So let me just give you a list of some really important names to know for World War II. If you think that Hitler was a bad guy, he didn't do it alone. He had other guys who were just as bad and just as evil. And one of the worst guys in the Nazi regime was Hermann Goering. He's the head of the Gestapo and the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe is the German Air Force. So get used to that word right there, the Luftwaffe. The Gestapo is like the secret police. These are the guys who go around and track down the Jews. These are the guys who, if they think you're a spy or an enemy against the Nazi regime, they're the ones who take you out behind your house and shoot you in the head. Or they don't take you behind the house. They drag you to the town square and hang your body so that everybody in the town can see what happens to people who resist Nazi occupation. This is the Gestapo, the secret police, and the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Hermann Goering was a pilot during World War I, and during World War II, he's the head of the Air Force. Hermann Goering. He is an absolute Nazi, an absolute evil guy. He's a bad guy to every extent. Another guy who maybe is Hitler's right-hand man is Heinrich Himmler. Himmler might be one of the worst members of the Nazi regime. He's the head of the SS, the Schutzstaffel. Now, my German's not really great, and so maybe I mispronounced that, but the Schutzstaffel was like the special forces of the German army. They're the ones, the SS are the ones who run the concentration camps where they kill all the Jewish people. They're the ones who are running the death camps. They're the ones, when the Nazis go into Russia, they're the ones who execute and burn down towns. They're like the special division, the psycho part of the army that goes around doing all the really bad stuff. There's a lot of guys who served in the German army who are great people, who are nice people. They just got drafted by their country to fight in a war that they didn't want to fight in. Not all the people who were fighting with the Germans were bad guys, but the members of the SS, they're bad. And the Gestapo, they're bad. So Goering and Himmler, they're as bad as Hitler. Okay? There were some German guys, this is going to sound weird, who were good guys, like Erwin Rommel. I think that Erwin Rommel is one of the most respectable generals of the war. He is amazing. People nicknamed him the Desert Fox because of how witty and how foxy he was down in the deserts of North Africa. And he was just kicking butt. And everybody on both sides respected him. Erwin Rommel died because he was probably involved in a plot to kill Hitler. He was a German general and he was involved in a plot to probably kill Hitler. I say probably because there's evidence to say he was. It's pretty well understood that he was involved in one of the plots. It's another sign that not all of the Nazis were bad guys, and a lot of the Nazis wanted to win the war, and they felt like Hitler was holding them back. Hitler was making irrational choices, and he got so sucked into the killing Jews and wasting resources on killing Jewish prisoners in death camps when some of those resources could have been spent to win the war. And people like Rommel said, if we get Hitler out of power, we can win the war. So it wasn't like he was all about peace and a loving guy. It's just that he wasn't a psychopath like Himmler and Goering. Rommel is a respectable guy. When he got orders to, kill innocent people, he ignored those orders. We have a lot of evidence showing that Rommel was a pretty respectable guy. He was ruthless on the battlefield, but he wasn't a psychopath. He wasn't out there just like a Nazi killing machine. He was just really good at his job, and people respected him. So I like to kind of point out somebody like Erwin Rommel as a German Nazi who's maybe really not a bad guy. I hope that that's making sense. I'm happy to answer questions about it in class. Now, if we jump over to the US, we're going to have two key players because one's going to be the head of the war in Europe and one's going to be the head of the war in the Pacific. So the head of US troops in the European theater is Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's going to be in charge of all Allied troops in the D-Day invasion. He is going to become president of the United States after World War II. So after FDR dies, Harry Truman takes over and finishes the war. And then after that, Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of the top generals from the US and for the whole Allied effort, he's in charge of the war in Europe. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Because there's two theaters of the war, we have Douglas MacArthur, who's the head of the Pacific Asian for the American and also for a lot of the Allied effort over in the Pacific. The U.S. took the brunt of the effort over in the Pacific Asia War. The U.S. did not take the brunt of it in the European theater. The Soviets did for sure. Okay, and the British took plenty of hits as well. The British and the Soviets, and of course the French get knocked out early on, and then maybe come back at the end. Um, but Douglas MacArthur really was running the show over in the Pacific theater, at least with the Allied troops. He was stationed in the Philippines when war breaks out. He has to leave the Philippines. He wasn't going to. He was like, I'm going to stay here and die or win. And the US president forced him, to pull his troops out of the Philippines so that he didn't die there. But he swore and promised he would return to the Philippines. So MacArthur is a major key player. He's an amazing figure in history. This guy is the head of the U.S. military in the Pacific during World War II. But he also was the head of the Allied forces during the Korean War. That's during the 1950s after World War II. And he also fought as a young man. He was one of the leaders during World War I. So this guy is epic. This guy's father was a Civil War vet. I don't know if you just heard what I said, but MacArthur's dad fought in the Civil War. And here's this guy fighting in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. I mean, talk about a legacy and talk about a crossover of lives. If Douglas MacArthur is around to see the nuclear weapon, right, the first atomic bomb to be dropped on Hiroshima and second on Nagasaki in Japan, and to think that his dad fought in the Civil War when we were freeing our slaves. That's interesting, the connection of history. This guy is not the guy in charge, but probably the most famous military general from the United States during World War II, George Patton. I mean, this guy is just a wild card, and he is just amazing on the battlefield, but he just can't help himself when he's not on the battlefield. He's just almost too much of a loose cannon to be good for himself, and causes some problems and gets himself into trouble. But in the end, really is one of those key dominant generals that everybody respects if he could just keep his mouth shut. There's some other names as well that aren't generals, like Oppenheimer. When people think about the atomic bomb and how we end World War II, some of the science and the physics involved in making the bomb had been discussed by people like Albert Einstein. Remember, Albert Einstein actually lived in Germany. He was living, he was from that area. He was a German scientist, and he was Jewish. And when all of the stuff started happening with the anti-Semitic, propaganda and policies in Germany, Albert Einstein bailed, and he got out. And so he wrote a lot of papers and talked about what German scientists were working on under the Nazi regime. And he was scared, and even talked to the US president and said, we got to get on this. But Einstein wasn't actually involved with the Manhattan Project. That was the secret operation where we developed the first atomic bombs. But Oppenheimer, he was the real leader, I guess, the scientific mind behind the Manhattan Project, where we developed the first atomic bomb. Besides Hirohito and Tojo, which were the real leaders of Japan during World War II, we have to talk about some of the other important key players from Japan. Yamamoto is one of the most famous leaders. He's the guy who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. Interestingly enough, Yamamoto went to college at Harvard. Yeah, I'm talking about, by Boston, Massachusetts, right? That Harvard. Yamamoto went to school in the United States, spoke fluent English, and yet he was one of the guys who helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. The British had plenty of their famous generals. I think the most well recognized was Monty Montgomery, right? Bernard Montgomery. He was famous for fighting Erwin Rommel in the deserts of North Africa. And he's, of course, part of that expedition to go in and fight and kill the Nazis off and win the victory at the end of World War II. But Montgomery is one of the most famous British generals during the war. We can't forget that China took a huge brunt of the war over in Asia. There are two significant Chinese leaders. They both hate each other. They were fighting with each other before World War II broke out, and they will fight each other after World War II. Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was the nationalist leader of China. The U.S. backed Chiang Kai-shek, but he was really a warlord. He was a bad guy too, but we just happened to like him more than Mao Zedong, the communist leader of China, who was maybe even more of a warlord and a ruthless guy. On a list of people who have been responsible for more human deaths, most people will put Mao Zedong as the guy who's responsible for the most deaths in his country while he's the leader. He takes the number one spot, Mao Zedong. And number two is usually Stalin, Joseph Stalin, for the number of people killed while they're in charge of their country. And Hitler usually takes number three. So to just brush off Mao Zedong and not talk about him more is probably a mistake. However, this is an AP European history class, so we're going to focus more on that perspective. But if you want to talk about who Mao Zedong is, and I'll deal with him in a later, after World War II, he's the leader of China for decades. And so I'll be talking about him in our decolonization and modern, the shaping of the modern world. We'll talk more about Mao Zedong. Okay. But here's a little link to the worst dictators in modern history, and that they put, because they do a sheer number count of dead bodies, and Mao Zedong takes number one, Stalin number two, Hitler number three, etc. World War II is amazing because we have video footage, real video footage, tons of photographs. We even, by the end of the war, get some great color video. So World War II is by far the most documented war in history, and we get to see it and kind of live it in a way. I don't think there's been a topic where more movies have been made about a topic than World War II. I mean, there are so many movies about World War II. Okay. There are some major ideological differences between Germany in World War I and World War II. So we have to kind of pause. We kind of see Germany as the bad guys, both in World War I and World War II, because they're on the opposite team. But I think it's important to recognize that Germany in World War I is just a country, just like France, just like the United States, and they're fighting a war. But I don't think they're really evil and bad. But when we switch over to World War II, there's a definite ideological difference. And that's when we get into this racist Nazism, where we start to see really a certain group, a certain percentage of the German population that's under this Nazi ideology that's definitely bad. And so that's where they get this evil reputation, if you will. But I think we have to be smarter than that and kind of distinguish between the two. So one of the things we got to talk about is how big and bad is World War II. I've seen lots of estimations, but generally people are talking over 70 million. I've seen estimates higher than that. I've seen some estimates a little bit lower, but they also separate civilian casualties from those that actually died in the battlefield, and they don't always take into consideration. What about this? What about the people who starved to death in India because their food was taken by the British Empire to feed their troops on the front line? Are those people that starved to death in India part of the British Empire? Are those part of this World War II death toll that we should count? Because they died because of World War II. Or do we separate that and say, well, they died of starvation, not on the battlefield, so we shouldn't throw those numbers in? I mean, there's so many pieces of the puzzle like that. What about those people that died in the concentration camps? Those people that died in Africa who just happened to be at the wrong place at on the wrong time when, British and German forces clashed at El Alamein, up in North Africa. How many US soldiers were killed? 400,000. That's not even half 1 million. So the United States, again, is. I'm not trying to disqualify 400,000 deaths. That's a huge number. But I'm also trying to put into perspective our part in this war. Stalin famously said, "One death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic." So sometimes these numbers become so big it's almost impossible to comprehend. I mean, look at this number of US deaths compared to Soviet deaths. This is 500,000. This is 25 million. That's staggering to think about. Germany lost over 9 million. China, almost as many as the Soviet Union. Japan, 3 million. Well, you think, whoa, that's actually pretty low numbers compared to other places, even though they were bombed and, at the end of the war, they're the only country where we actually dropped atomic bombs on, right? This list does not include all of the people who were injured or who were displaced because of the war. When we deal with casualties, you got to be careful when you look at data. Sometimes casualties will refer to people injured or lost or dead. So there's different kind of numbers, and these are just to try to give you a ballpark figure. I highly recommend you watch this video. It will show you country by country. It shows you if we stacked coffins, like one person's coffin, and we laid them on top of each other, how many people died. I mean, just looking at this picture right here, you can see the number of people that died from the United States compared to Korea. Wow, I didn't even know. I mean, I guess Korea was involved. Whoa, that's amazing. And the people, whoa, and the number of people who died from Japan versus the people that died from France. Anyways, a great little video. Only takes like 3 minutes, and it's just fascinating to see how many people died. Here's another chart to kind of give you an idea of, and it's not just people who die on the battlefield, it's civilians and who took the brunt of the war, right? And so if you take a look at this and you're like, whoa, Latvia, well, I didn't even think about, and Burma, interesting. Even places like India and Indonesia, places you wouldn't think about, like Romania and Hungary, that are greatly affected by World War II. Okay. The keys to Allied victory in World War II. So I guess this is the spoiler alert. The Allies win. How do they win? At first, the United States tried to stay neutral, but over time sends more and more aid to the Allies. Things like the Lend-Lease Act. These countries were honestly still in debt from World War I, and every major player was still in a Great Depression economically. And so to dive into an even bigger war, some of these countries were borrowing, on good faith. Hey, we'll get you back. We're good for it, kind of a thing. Before the United States even got involved in the war, economically, we started to supply, the Russians. We started to supply the British. We would love to supply the French, but they were kicked out of the war so early that we couldn't really do that. So the Lend-Lease Act and the Atlantic Charter are ways that the U.S. gets involved economically before we actually start fighting. And I guess that's the key. American industry. Once the U.S. enters the war, factory production kicks into high gear and really helps end the Great Depression. There was even these cash carry policies where before we got involved in the war, like the British would the Atlantic Charter was kind of like this plan. If when the U.S. gets involved in the war, here's what we're going to do. Okay, but this cash carry policy is like British. You can buy as much as you want, but you need to ship it because there's German wolf packs, these U-boats that are patrolling the waters that are sinking merchant ships. So if you want to carry it on your ships, we're happy to sell it to you, kind of a thing. The Battle of the Atlantic is maybe the most unsexy part of the war, but probably one of the most important. It's ships going across the Atlantic with supplies. And I know that doesn't sound really dramatic and exciting. It could be freaking scary if there's U-boats hunting you and tons of ships are sunk. But it's all about supplies, because no matter how brave you are, or no matter how bad you want to win the war, no matter how great your plans are and your speeches are, you can't win if you don't have bullets. And you can't win if you don't have food in your stomach, and you can't win if you don't have good boots on your feet. So supplies become one of the most important parts of World War II. You can't forget that the US and her allies are fighting two wars at the same time, one in Asia and one in the Europe Africa part of the war. Just like in World War I, when the men are shipped off to the front lines, women often filled in on jobs that were typically men jobs. You've probably seen those posters of Rosie the Riveter, right? Where she's, "We can do it, ladies." And this is one of the things that helps women, I think, really take an equal place in society. Women had just gotten the right to vote after World War I, and World War II is going to change women's role in society permanently. It's going to majorly affect the home front. Food and fuel were rationed. This rationing was implemented in Great Britain and in the US and other places to support the war effort. It's a total war. Every part of society, little kids would go around with their wagons and collect scrap metal to turn it into metal factories where they can melt it down and turn it into bullets and tanks and planes and ships. It's a full effort. People grew victory gardens, so they grew their own vegetables so that the food produced on large farms could be sent off to the front lines or maybe shipped over to the Russians because they were our allies in the war, right? Women took non traditional jobs as men went off to fight. This forever changed the social structure of Western nations. A wartime draft was implemented in many nations. So, a draft, of course, is where the government requires men of a certain age to sign up for military duty. But places like the United States, there were some people volunteering before we even joined in the war. There were some Americans who joined the British Eagle Squadron. There were some who joined the Fighting Tigers over in Asia. There were some Americans who had even gotten involved in the Spanish Civil War before World War II broke out. But patriotism, and I think sometimes even a little bit of social, trying to think of the right word here, peer pressure, social peer pressure, kind of forced people to enlist. Like, are you a real man? You better join the army. And you guys are probably seeing the movies like Captain America, where, of course, it's a superhero movie, but you kind of get a sense of, this young guy who wants to join the military, but he's not tall enough, he's not strong enough, and he wants to go and serve his country. He feels like he's not a real man until he does that, and that was kind of the feeling. Very patriotic. A lot of people call it the greatest generation. These guys who, stepped up to the plate when their country called. After World War II, there is an era in U.S. history called the Civil Rights Movement, which is led by blacks who defeated a segregated country. Let me just pause for a minute. If we ask ourselves, what makes the Nazis evil? I mean, really, what makes the Nazis so evil in our minds? I think most of us would say because of what they did to the Jewish people. They targeted a certain group of people, they segregated them in their society, treated them as less than human, and they killed them in these concentration camps. Well, if you're an African American who's living in the South under Jim Crow laws, and you're recruited into the US Army and you have to serve in a segregated unit, and you go off to fight the Nazis, and the Nazis are evil because of what they're doing to the Jewish people, and then you come home and you can't even go to a school, or you can't even use a bathroom just for white people, or you can't even drink from a drinking fountain or sit at a lunch counter because it's whites only in the South. You can see the hypocrisy there, right? I mean, that's serious. So this is going to lead to a civil rights movement, right? Many African Americans fought in the war, like the Red Tails, very famous. They come home to a country where they have white only bathrooms and drinking fountains. And I hope that makes sense. So this is a quandary that we have to deal with as Americans. And it's not an easy one to deal with. US propaganda posters trying to get people inspired to help, to buy war bonds, to give their money to the government to help fight, and then to grow their own food. And of course, the famous "I want you for the American Army" recruiting. But there's also propaganda for other countries, right? Okay. Hey, Russians, hold on. We're going to help you, the British are saying, right? And of course, Rosie the Riveter, she's maybe the most famous. And these scary posters, of like, if we don't stop this, the Nazis are going to overtake everything. Some are moving us to remember, right? Remember December 11th. Sorry, December 7th, right? I was thinking September 11th because we kind of use these same iconic posters after 9/11. But yeah, this is, remember Pearl Harbor, we will never forget. Those are same things we said after 9/11. But you can see these US propaganda posters. I thought this was kind of a funny one. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. What's this promoting? I think one of the problems that people have in AP class is they think it's all about memorizing facts, and it's not. It's about having an intellectual mind where you can see beyond the facts. So, what is this really promoting? This is promoting conserving gas. That's what an AP level brain does. We're not really talking about who cares if you ride alone. The point is that if you're car sharing, if you're carpooling, as we call it today, you're conserving gas, and then we have more gas to use in our tanks and planes. So if you ride alone, you're helping the enemy. And I saw a similar poster when we were fighting the war on terrorism. Anyways, we've modernized some of the same propaganda. Remember that World War One sets the stage for World War Two. When World War One ends with an armistice, there was no clear winners on the battlefield. The Germans rightly felt that they did not lose on the battlefield. The Germans lost the war, but not because they were beat. So they lost because some of their leaders threw in the towel, so to speak, made treaties with the Allied countries. They were always looking to blame someone, and the Treaty of Versailles is going to be something that just plagues the German heart, and it's something that Hitler uses as a propaganda piece. We didn't really lose the war, and yet we were punished. So the Treaty of Versailles is overly harsh on Germany and the other losers of the war. It's like if you beat somebody up and then you just keep kicking them in the head, they're gonna be your enemy forever. We broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman empires after World War One. That causes some bitter feelings. We redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East after World War One. These things set the stage for World War Two. Land was taken away, along with overseas territories from the Germans. These were problems. And maybe the worst one and the most easy to point at is the reparations. Making Germany pay for the cost of World War One economically destroys their country and sets the stage for radical ideologies to take place. We prevented Germany from having a military force. So, how did they end up with the biggest army, maybe in the world? They had to do it in secret. And that's what kind of gave Hitler his power in Germany. When things get desperate, people will look to anyone who promises to fix things. I highly recommend you go to my notes and take a minute to look at this chart because we see some of the problems from World War One that lead to the start of World War Two. We see the United States becoming isolationist, like, hey, we didn't like World War One, we don't want to do that again. To Germany being felt like they were stabbed in the back, and the resentment of the Jewish population in Germany and using them as a scapegoat. These economic turbulence, both of the stock market crash in the US and countries started started to break from the gold standard, which had always been used and kept currencies stable. And so everything currencies get out of control and inflation just rockets. Russia Russia dumped World War One to have its own civil war. And so it has its own problems right during the middle of these wars. And it's interesting to see how World War One and World War Two are so absolutely interconnected. That kind of is where we're going to end it this week. Remember, we're not done with World War II, not even close. Next week, we're going to talk about the war in Europe. I'll talk about Hitler and the Nazis and how they take over Europe, and then eventually how the Allies win. And then the week after that, with week 20, so that's week 28. And then week 29, we're going to talk about the war in Asia. So we've got a couple weeks left on World War II, but hopefully this gets you involved, helps lay down some of the groundwork. And of course, like always, there's some great videos at the end of each week that kind of, lay out some key things about, in this case, World War II. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next week when we talk about World War II in Europe.